We've been looking at these two texts pretty much for the last couple of weeks. I've never done that. I keep using the same text over and over, maybe taking a little line out, maybe adding a little one here that we didn't look at the last week. But the more we look at these, the more I hope you're thinking about how they settle in to your consciousness about what it is that really is sort of an invitation to us in all of our difficult moments, in all of our challenging moments. I mean, so how do we think on things that are true when we're pretty much oriented around whatever our opinion is on what is true, and that's always going to differ from somebody else, or what is honest, or what is good? All of these things really reflect the difficulties they had 2,000 years ago in being a community, the difficulties we still have these 2,000 years later in being a community, in being not just community with others, but actually also in communion with ourselves. So that's why the second part is there. How do we love one another? But we also have to find time for self-compassion in order to know how to truly love others. So that's kind of what we've been playing with. So think about it for just a second as we get started with this one. Where in your life, you can't think of your own example, but maybe think of someone else, but where in your life has your life been turned upside down? You were going along, you were living life the way you thought you should be living, things were going the way that you thought they should be going, and then suddenly your life's turned upside down. Plans did not go according the way you expected them to. Think about that. See if you can actually visualize that moment. If it's not too painful, honestly, don't go anywhere where it's painful or it's scary. But if there's something that you can think of where things didn't go, and I've got simple ones, and I've got big ones, because I didn't plan, number one, on being a storyteller for 25 years prior to coming here and doing this again for the last 8 years. I didn't plan on being a minister for 12 years or 10 years prior to going off into the world and being a storyteller and a musician with a ukulele, of all things, right? That wasn't my plan. I didn't go to college at University of Texas, go Longhorns. I didn't do that, and I didn't do that and think to myself, yeah, I went there thinking I was going to be a psychologist. Actually, my wife tells me, she said she married me because she distinctly remembers me saying I was going pre-med. 50 years later, she still reminds me that. You know, when we're driving around town and stuff. You said you were going medical school anyway. So plans change, right? Then you have kids, and then you have other things happen in your life, relationships and such. I'll share a couple of quick things. Our kids didn't turn out to be the way we expected them. I think one of them's watching. I love you very much, Tim. I love you. But they didn't turn out the way we expected. Things completely threw us for loops at times. At times, we experienced things with our kids that we literally didn't think we might survive. Seriously, got pretty dark at times. But I remember early on, I should have noticed some things early on. For like our youngest one, the first time he was taking communion. And these are PKs, right? Preacher's kids, so you know what's going to happen. They have a hard life to live. They're living sort of next to these people who are sort of like pedestal kinds of images, you know. And so we kind of have to look the other way when they take the wheelchairs and they have races up and down the church halls when they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old. And when he went down to take his first communion at a Christmas Eve service, and Luther Henry, one of our former ministers that back then in those days, he was coming along and he was offering communion to everyone, and he offered communion to Matthew, well, actually to me, and then to a friend of ours, and then to Matthew, and he was like, the body and blood of Christ, the body and blood of Christ, the body and blood of Christ. Came to Matthew with the bread, and Matthew looked at him with the strangest look, looked at the others, he said, the body and blood of Christ, and he said, pass. And Luther turned around, chuckling, couldn't stop himself from laughing. And we were just sitting there going like, I'm sorry, we're sorry. And that was kind of the beginning. And then, of course, the tag that you saw at the beginning, that I showed at the very beginning, that's my older son, Tim, who's an amazing artist. He tagged that on his backyard fence. And then his cat one day came out there and started staring at it. And so we took a picture of it. You know, and then all these years later, we're using it as a sermon illustration. But there's these parts of our kids that we don't always expect, right? So we have to learn to adapt. We learn to move with the way things happen. How do we do that? When life throws you for a loop, how do you learn to move with things when things start to happen? So one of our good friends no longer with us. Aaron Rivera was a beautiful young man, best friends with my older son, Tim. He had 2 or 3 different forms of childhood cancer, leukemia, then brain cancer. He had a number of different cancers that developed. And he was very active with an organization called Kids Who Care. Some of you know about Kids Who Care. And he was kind of like the poster child for a lot of different groups and businesses in the area because he was such a triumphant kind of little kid. And I say little because his growth had been stunted also because of the cancers and the treatment. One thing that he suffered from was optic cancer. And so he had a prosthetic eye. And the Dallas Cowboys designed a glass eye for Aaron. And it had the star on it. Now, naturally, as Aaron got older, the glass eye didn't change in shape. But there would be times that, and he got one that would fit as he grew a little bit, but he would sometimes put that glass eye in, that Cowboys one, especially when he wanted to take advantage of it. Like if we went to the movies and it was getting really boring, he would sort of look down on the floor and the eye would fall out. And it would hit the ground, and then he would start running down the aisle with his eye socket open going, "I lost my eye." Or when we go trick-or-treating with him, and he would follow, and my wife was taking the boys trick-or-treating around our neighborhood, around the block, and they walked up to a house, and sure enough, the guy there thought he was very clever. He had one of those googly-eyed costumes on, right? So the eyes were kind of bouncing out on the spring, googly eyes, and going, "Hey, what do you think of my eyes?" And Aaron literally pulled his out and said, "What do you think of mine?" And the guy was so tongue-tied, he's just like, take the candy, and he kind of closed the door. And I kind of bet he never came back out that night, you know. I mean, I think about someone like Aaron, and I think about others that I've met over the years who've dealt with some real challenges, some difficult life loops, if you will. And how have they faced them, but with a sense of curiosity and a sense of interest, taking an interest in what was happening, and then improvising as they went along the way. When I was, I want to go to this first picture. Let's throw this first one up there. I saw this online some time back, and I've kept it around every now and then. Sometimes I'll throw it up on Facebook. Think of all the different ways we feed the fears, right? We feed it all the time. We stoke the fears, especially right now around politics time. I don't know what side you're voting on. It doesn't really matter. If you have signed up for your political team, so to speak, you are getting texts 20 times a day. And as we've gotten closer and closer, they are more and more dire, desperate. The other side is going to win. The other side is going to triumph. The other side, you realize what the other side is going to do. There is this fear-mongering that goes on. Both parties do it. Some do it better than others, but both parties do it. They build and they lean on the effectiveness of stoking our fear. The same challenge is true for us because it's our nature, it's our natural state, it's our biological state to want to defend ourselves, to want to protect ourselves. So when life throws us a loop, our natural inclination is, this is terrible. Not just it's terrible, but my life has come to an end. Everything is going to completely be destroyed because of this reality. So even past the pain, we begin to suffer. The challenge for us is not to stoke the fear without losing the genuineness and authenticity of the emotion. Because life is difficult. Life is painful. There are times in our lives when we are excruciatingly sad or broken. And it's difficult to know what to do next. But the thing I would say don't do is feed the fear. In any way and every way possible, how can we not feed the fear in our own lives and begin to take care of ourselves? This is the way Ursula Le Guin put it. Ursula Le Guin, the author, one of my favorite sci-fi fantasy authors, she said, "The worst walls are never the ones that you find in your way. The worst walls are the ones that you put there." Very much similar to the quote that we've often said with Rumi, who says, "Don't seek for love, but seek all the barriers we create against love," right? The challenge with loving our neighbor as ourselves is that sometimes we forget the walls that we're putting there as a barrier to our own experience of deep compassion. And it's easy enough for us to try to love others, oftentimes even as a way of sort of stoking our own sense of inadequacy. What are the walls that we're putting up there? I heard this phrase from this author. If you read my blog post this last week, I quoted this author. Her name is, I'm going to get it here just a second. Chelsea Lugar. Chelsea Lugar is a Chippewa indigenous person from North Dakota. And she wrote this wonderful book, just came out, that's called The 7 Circles, Indigenous Techniques for Living Well. And I heard her interviewed, and what I love that she said, there's a couple of things. I quoted one of the little stories that she told in the blog, but one of the things she said that I thought was really amazing, and it's so simple, but it seems like a great affirmation. There's something in you that is stronger than what you're going through. There's something in you that's stronger than what you're going through. I shared the story on the blog post of the biosphere, the Biosphere 2 outside of Phoenix, Arizona, where they discovered something really amazing and curious. The trees were growing too fast and they were falling over. They simply weren't taking root. They were dying. They looked at everything possible explanation. Some kind of bug got inside this sealed environment, some kind of fungus, tree fungus, some kind of problem with the soil. Nothing seemed to be clear about what was causing the trees to just grow quickly and then fall over until someone came up with the curious idea, there's no wind inside a bubble. There's no wind. There's no stress on the tree. Amazing. Such a simple, unexpected reality, but without the stress on the tree, something essential doesn't grow. Now, I would dare never say what you go through is because God's trying to teach you something. Don't take that for what that's saying at all. But what I want to suggest it's saying is, maybe God's the heartwood at the core and the center of who we all are, that we sometimes have to remember to tap into, to lean into, to trust in deeply enough in ourselves and our own strength to see what we're dealing with more compassion, more curiosity, more interest. What does that word interest mean? You remember? I haven't said it here in a long time, but if you look up the root word, it means to bring to life. You find something interesting, it's bringing life to you, but when you bring life to life, you are bringing interest to the moment. You are taking interest in the moments. How do we take interest in our own pain? How do we take interest in our own challenges? Rather than being victim, the invitation is to pursue something much more intentionally. This next picture is one of my favorite pictures. When's the last time you did that? Seriously, show of hands, when's the last time you did that? No? You haven't done that? Have you? Okay, Sharm, you've got grandchildren. Not with a magnifying glass. But you've leaned down there. You've looked down there when they've said, what is this thing down here? And you've looked down there at that, right? This is really what life is all about. It's really about this invitation to develop curiosity even in our most difficult times. Is to be willing to lean into the heartwood that's a part of us, that's being invited for us to participate in with some curiosity, with some self-compassion. Sometimes that means that when we hear the stories that we're telling ourselves because of the grief we're feeling, we have to remind ourselves we are more than that story. It's painful. This is difficult. This isn't what I expected. We're more than this moment, though. And there is something in us that's stronger than what's happening to us. This next one is something I like because I've shared with you that attention is one of the most sacred things that we can offer others. Listening to the other stories, even those with whom we disagree the most. They come up to us, we're afraid, right? We're afraid, they make us anxious. What are we doing? We're feeding the fear. Don't feed the fear. They might be a little scary, but maybe there's something curious there too. Maybe there's something interesting there that we're not paying attention to. Maybe there's more to that story than we've actually allowed to be told, than they even know themselves. So I've suggested how we show that for others. When's the last time you did it for yourself? I don't know how many times, well, you all know because I've often shared with you in here how much I like to beat myself up after almost every sermon I've ever spoken, right? I'll walk away, 40 people come up, 20 people. All right, only 2 people come up and say how much they really liked it. But in spite of that, I walk home or I go home and I'm already beating myself up on the way home, right? I'm already telling myself stories. How many times do we tell ourselves stories about what's going on around us? When we'd be gladly pay attention to someone else and go like, I think you probably have a really fascinating story. But we don't look at ourselves and go, why do I keep telling myself that story when there's so many other stories and other possibilities? There's something in us that's stronger than what's happening to us. That heartwood, the ground of being, God is a very creative love at the source of our lives that we just sometimes don't give ourselves the permission to participate in. So how do we do that? How do we nurture ourselves? I invite you to stop telling yourselves the stories that you're telling and to tell yourselves new stories. If you have to invent them, invent them. Lord knows children make it in the world because they invent stuff. So invent stories to tell yourselves. You have my permission to completely lie to yourself as long as it's loving and kind and compassionate. All right? The second thing is pay attention to life around you. The other story that I told in the blog post fascinated me because it reminded me of my uncle who lived on a farm for years. He got me interested in bluegrass, actually got me interested in the ukulele back when I was a small child. But this story was also from Chelsea, as she told about being with her grandfather outside of Arizona on her grandfather's reservation when a dust storm blew up. And her grandfather quickly ducked her and her dad into the pickup truck. And she was a young woman, and her 2 baby boys were in the back. She's watching her grandfather, who closes the door instead of jumping in the front seat and cramming in there with them. And the dust storm comes out of nowhere and covers them in a cloud of black and brown and dust, twigs, everything flying around for a couple of minutes. She looks at her grandfather, who's holding on with both hands. But then she can't see him very clearly. When the dust settles down, the dust storm's blown just about as fast as it came. He knocks on the window, says, come on out, everything's good, let's keep talking. She comes out and she says, Grandfather, your hat's gone. He had a cowboy hat that he pulled down. He says, well, some things you got to know when to let go of them, and some things you got to know when to hold on. He said, I needed both hands this time. She said after the talk and after, some years later, she said what it really reminded her was not so much how brave he was. It was the fact that he understood what life was about. And he'd experienced enough of life to know this is something he can handle. This is something he can see through. We don't know what we're capable of. We don't know what we can handle. But we have to be willing to trust that there is something within us that's stronger than what's happening to us. And whether you call that creative love, or you call that God at the heart of our being, or you call that Jesus when you lean into a prayer, it really doesn't matter. It matters that you do it. It matters that you lean into that with openness and courage. Courage just means open-heartedness. And that you try to do everything in your power not to feed the fear. Because it's so tempting to go there. Let's skip down to this last one. Not the next one. I shared this with you last week. I think this is the most beautiful image. How many ways can we nurture our moments? With creativity and curiosity, how many ways can we do that? So whenever we feel ourselves in some of the lowest times, I know it's hard. I know it's hard to get motivated. I've dealt with depression for years. I know how difficult that can be, but it takes practice. And it takes practice now before we find ourselves in the midst of those situations. It takes an intentionality to go out and say, today I'm just going to be curious and pay attention to the most simplest details. I'm going to pay attention to others who scare me a little bit and discover, oh wait, there's something in me that's stronger than my fear of that person. Who knew? And then I'm going to practice that over and over, because the more I practice, the more I begin to strengthen that heartwood the more I begin to strengthen that spirit within me that allows me to open up more to self-compassion. But in order to do that, we have to be willing to face the strange with courage, openness, and intentionality, which is why we have this next song. I thought you guys were in place. This next song by David Bowie really speaks to this idea of facing things that are uncomfortable, facing things that we don't understand, because there's more to it than what we've thought about ourselves or what we think about others.